Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Metropolitan Community College today for continued virtual programming in observance of Juneteenth. Juneteenth, short for June 19th, marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people be freed. The troops' arrival came a full 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth honors the end to slavery in the United States and is considered the longest-running African-American holiday. Just last year, June 17th, 2021, Juneteenth officially became a federal holiday. Your microphones are silenced. Please use the chat function to send communications to Barbara Velasquez, moderator. Your questions will be presented to our speaker after her presentation. Please also watch the chat for a link to an online evaluation. Dr. Maria Esther Hammack received her Ph.D. in U.S. history with certified portfolios in African and African diaspora studies and women and gender studies from the University of Texas at Austin in May 2021. She is a Mexican scholar and public historian whose work centers and connects through a gender lens the histories of liberation and abolition in North America and the Black diaspora in Mexico. She is currently revising her first monograph, Channels of Liberation, Black Freedom Across the U.S.-Mexican Global South, a work that examines and recovers the transnational experiences of Black Americans situated as freedom fighters who left the United States to claim and secure liberation in Mexican spaces. Since 2019, she has served as an editorial assistant of the Journal of African American History and presently also serves as a representative of the AHA's 2021-2024 Graduate and Early Career Committee. Maria is the 2021-2023 McNeil Center's Barra Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Maria states, as a transnational scholar born and raised in Mexico, with lived experiences as a crosser of borders myself, my goal is to create initiatives that advance and strengthen the pipeline for Black and Brown students, scholars, and migrants in and outside of academia. Please give a hearty welcome to Dr. Maria Esther Hammack for her presentation, The Diaspora and the Meaning of Freedom Across the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Barbara. And I'm very excited to have been invited to do this presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. So also thank you so much for Metropolitan College for hosting me today. Let me see if I can share my screen. Is everyone able to see my presentation? Wonderful, perfect, okay. So it is a pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of these important histories in celebration of Juneteenth. And while Barra gave you a brief introduction of Juneteenth, I'm going to highlight a few things that I have been researching about the celebration, and as well offer you some context on the meaning of Juneteenth and the meaning of freedom that is shared by the U.S. and Mexico. And then we'll end with a Q&A at the end, where we can have a conversation, and I'll able to answer some questions that you may have. And on that note, so what exactly is Juneteenth? Juneteenth, as we all know, has become a celebration of freedom. As of last year, it became a federal holiday. And it is certainly a celebration of liberation, of the struggle for it, and of the perseverance, resistance, and fight of Black Americans and their allies. Juneteenth and everything Juneteenth entails and represents how it is its foundational aspects and how it connects the shared histories of the US and Mexico is also a history that must be celebrated, but also a history that has been largely remain unknown or undertold. Many of us perhaps think that Juneteenth signifies the abolition of slavery or the beginning of freedom for all people held enslaved in the United States. But that is quite not accurate. Juneteenth was prompted by the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation as of January 1st of 1863. And the Emancipation Proclamation, however, this proclamation did not actually abolish slavery, but declared, and I'm quoting from it, all persons held as slaves within rebellious states are henceforth to be free. This meant, the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation meant that only people held enslaved within the Confederate States, or as they were called, the rebel states, were the only ones who were officially being declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, the official abolition of slavery in the United States did not happen until June 13th, until the 13th Amendment, until the 13th Amendment was passed on January 31st of 1865. So about 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, this amendment was not actually, ratified until December 6th of 1865. So keep that in mind. This was also way after, a few months, like about 6 months after Juneteenth, after June 19th of 1865. So the 13th Amendment itself, for instance, declared, and I'm quoting as well the 13th Amendment, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crimes whereof the party should have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So what does that mean for the abolition of slavery in the US? That meant that even with the 13th Amendment, slavery was not completely abolished in the US. Today, that still remains true. It can be used for punishment, as the 13th Amendment explains. But let's not get ahead of June 19th, 1865. This is the date of Juneteenth, June 19th of 1865. A date that widely represents the very day that federal troops, as Barbara mentioned earlier, arrived in Texas to force slaveholders in that state to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation, which was at that time the law of the land that had been passed 2 years earlier. Juneteenth is today celebrated and had been celebrated in Texas since 1866 because it was the day that General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston with many, many troops to inform more than 250,000 people that have remained enslaved in Texas up until that point, that they were finally free and that they had been free for over 2 years. And if you read the order, let me see. So I have here a few of the things that I just said, but I also wanted to show you this proclamation that is, or the general order that was read by Gordon Granger right here. And this is actually the last surviving and known copy that was brought to Texas on June 19th of 1865. And it's actually held at the Dallas Historical Society. So I wanted to share it with you. And if you actually see and read the general order, which is right here, I put it there for you to visualize it. If you read it fully, it also actually says, even though Gordon Granger had arrived in Galveston to say, all of you are free and you have been free since 1865, then again, they weren't completely allowed to freely make their own choices to leave the plantations where they had been laboring enslaved, more likely since birth. If you read it, it says, freemen, you are free now, but you are advised to remain quietly at your present homes and work for wages. They didn't explain how their wages are going to come up. it was going to be sort of like whatever the slaveholders now employees would decide. But they were also informed that they will not be allowed to collect any help or military post, or that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. So you can still see, by these processes of freedom or emancipation or abolition, what Juneteenth really represented. It represents not only a celebration of freedom, but the struggle of freedom and the struggle to finally, bring liberation across the United States, but also across spaces along the United States South. And so some of the work that I do, I wanted to bring in the work that I do to allow you to understand what Juneteenth and that history that Juneteenth represents, how it has shaped the diaspora, or how it is an influential part of the Black diaspora and the meaning of freedom shared by the US and Mexico and their long shared histories. Juneteenth represents a history that is an integral part of that diaspora, and the diaspora that shaped the collective histories of North America, particularly the US and Mexico. Juneteenth is not only a holiday celebrated on this side of the border across the US, it is actually also a commemoration celebrated on Mexican soil. And we can trace part of these histories of why Juneteenth is celebrated in Mexican spaces. If we look back to the 1840s and 1860s, when several groups of enslaved and free Black persons left the United States to claim freedom in Mexican spaces, or just to look for better futures in Mexican spaces. This particular exodus was forced by, it started or shaped by US Indian removal policies instigated through the 1830s and beyond, and also by the institution of enslavement or chattel slavery in the US. After many failed attempts at negotiations back in the 1830s, between Native indigenous people and the US government, particularly Seminole people and Black Seminole people in the United States, these groups were forced to leave their original spaces, like places like Florida, for instance. They were forced to leave their homes, and they were removed to places like Oklahoma and Kansas, to Native reservations. And although some of these groups were not necessarily enslaved, because they were free, Native persons, but also free Black Native persons, they certainly faced large disenfranchisement, possible enslavement, and certainly very harsh realities in those Native reservations in Oklahoma or in Indian Territory. And because slavery was something many of these individuals, Black Seminoles and Seminole people, faced or could potentially face in the United States, many chose to just leave the US completely and make it to Mexico, make that trek south. So throughout the 1840s and 1850s, many members of these groups had already begun to trickle down individually. Sometimes it would go in families or in groups. And so they had started reaching Mexico, at late 1830s, 1840s. But the larger numbers of Native Seminole people, as well as Black Seminole people, and what they considered people that were running away from enslavement, they decided to trickle down in larger groups at the end of in 1849, and throughout that period, 1849, 1850. They went to Mexico under the guidance of two main leaders, and that was Wildcat, who is a Seminole leader, and John Horse, who was a Black Seminole Omascoa leader. And together they helped map this plan, or an official plan, to lead more members of those communities from Native territory deep into Mexico or south into Mexican territory. Mexican records show, that I have been able to locate, point to many of these arrivals when they started arriving in larger groups. For instance, one record dated July 13th of 1850 stated that on that date, a group of, and I'm quoting, more than 700 Black and Native men, women, and children braved the Rio Bravo and cross into Mexican territory through the area of Piedras Negras, which on this side is about the region of Eagle Pass. But this was not the first or only time people had crossed, nor the only geography that they had moved across through these spaces. People were traveling, trying to make it to Mexico, especially if they were born enslaved in the US or held enslaved in the US. They were either jumping on boats in places like New Orleans and trying to make it to Mexican spaces. They were crossing the Texas borderlands, but they were also crossing borderlands, as far as, if you think about Mexican California and Mexican Arizona and Mexican California. And I'll tell you a little bit about those spaces in a few minutes, as well as show you some maps to allow you to visualize these journeys. But as I mentioned, this was not the only time that people had crossed, but these groups in particular, the ones that crossed in the 1840s and 1850s, engineered communities mostly in northern Coahuila, so across the borderlands from Texas. And since their arrival in places like Coahuila, they sought to claim not only official securities or freedom, for instance, but they really wanted to secure lands and principally citizenship. And their efforts did pay off. By October of 1850, as you can see in the screen right here with Article 15A, the Mexican government passed the Código de Colonización, which is a colonization code, specifically for these recently arrived groups of Native and Black Seminoles. And this Código offered them something the US refused to offer Black Americans, particularly. It offered citizenship, it says here. Para establecerse en la República serán considerados como ciudadanos mexicanos. So they were offered Mexican citizenship. As of, for instance, for these groups, as of October 18th of 1850. By July 26th of 1852, the Seminole and Mascova people had secured lands. In fact, they have secured 4 sitios or 4 land grants in El Nacimiento de los Negros, which some of the pictures that I'm showing here pertain to those spaces. And they also secured 4 other land grants in Durango. But the Durango land grants were never really utilized, or they didn't really materialize into communities. And so, but the ones in El Nacimiento, which is in Coahuila, they did. By September 9th of 1854, the Mexican government ratified this law, so made it official. And that didn't really stop at that moment. There are instances where the Mexican government offered them assistance and protections because they were Mexican citizens up until that time. And today, these groups continue to own the land that they secured from the Mexican government in the 1850s. And every year they hold their festivals and community. There's like more like their festivals have become these family reunions and celebrations for Juneteenth, and they do it every year. So this is El Nacimiento, this is in Brackettville, and I'll explain a little bit about the history of Brackettville. And this is one of the independent scholars who has done a lot of this work, working with the communities in El Nacimiento de los Negros, with the Mascova people. His name is Doc Sibad, so keep an eye out for his upcoming book, because he's also part of those communities, and he's been working for many years on recovering those descendant stories. But also, just to finish with this particular slide, there was in the 20th century, about 1936, the Mexican president Lázaro Cárdenas granted specifically the Mascova people, or the Black Seminoles, about 4,000 acres in addition to what they had already received back in the 1850s, and mainly because they were experiencing a lot of drought. And so that was something to help ameliorate the losses that they had been experiencing. So that was just something that I found important to note for you. And so, and because part of the work that I do aims to highlight not only these histories and how they are bridging, how in instances or celebrations like Juneteenth are also celebrated in Mexican spaces, I wanted to give you an oral account of a Black woman who crossed the Rio Bravo in July 13th, 1850, and seeking freedom. And her experience, I think, will offer you an opportunity to connect with a very real story of people that were trying to make it to Mexico, and why, you know, this is important when we're considering what freedom meant for people crossing these spaces. So this is the recollection of Becky Simmons. Becky Simmons was an individual that left Native reservations in places like Oklahoma and crossed to Mexico on that night. And so she says, it was dark in about the middle of the night, so that we had to be hurrying to get through with the crossing. But the hours looked like 10 years, for we were close to the American race people that we wanted to get away from and across the river soon. We crossed first, meaning the women, and the men crossed after us. There was a skiller made out of logs, and I think she's talking about a skiller boat or a killer. There was like these log flatbeds across the river at that point that they tied together, that were tied together, that they crossed on, or that which we crossed on, she says. It was a good ride, for the men took long sticks to guide the traction across the river. I will never forget that time. Children were about to cry out because they were sleeping, and the old ones were scared that they were going to start bawling or crying before they could actually get over. So they were scared that the children were going to start crying before they could get over, because usually slave hunters and people were trying to prevent them from reaching Mexican spaces safely. And so here you can see this experience of a woman that crossed, and it gives you the idea that it was like very perilous, very dangerous. Individuals didn't only cross by themselves, they were clearly crossing with children, crossing with elderly people. And I think that it's important to also acknowledge when we're considering the meaning of freedom and the risk that people took to make it or to claim freedom in Mexican spaces. It is also important to note as well that even though the term Mascogo, as you know, the Black Seminoles have become known in Mexican spaces, that is a particular name that they use in that community of El Nacimiento de los Negros. But a lot of the times people don't realize that there were other groups that had arrived that were incorporated into these Mascogo communities. Several families were actually not of Black Seminole or Mascogo ancestry. Several families were actually Black Creek. Others were actually just individuals who had been enslaved in the US and had joined these groups to make it to freedom. Some of the Black Creek families that still reside in Mexican spaces are the Warrior family, the Factors, the Wilsons, the Graysons, the Perrymans, and others that actually have become sort of border crossers in the modern era. Some of the family members live in the Nacimiento and across Coahuila, and other members actually moved across and live in places like Brackettville, which has become a sister city of El Nacimiento de los Negros. And while El Nacimiento de los Negros in Coahuila is one of the largest settlements of these Black Seminole people, or the Mascogo people, that is not the only one across northern Coahuila where these groups that arrived in the 1850s settled. There were some others that were established as Santa Rosa, which is also in Coahuila, El Morral, Laguna de Parras, and others across this borderlands that is adjacent to Texas. But before I move on, now that I've given you a little context about Juneteenth and why it is celebrated, so well, actually I should say, one of the reasons Juneteenth is celebrated in Mexican spaces is because of these communities. These communities of Black Seminoles and Mascogos, some of the individuals that were living free in Mexico since the 1850s and before. So by the time 1865 came and freedom came for Texas, for people enslaved in Texas, they were celebrating that freedom happened. And fast forward to the 1870s, people from the same families that were living in El Nacimiento free moved across to Brackettville, which I mentioned a few minutes earlier. And those individuals in Brackettville started the celebrations of freedom of Juneteenth as early as the 1870s. As you know, in Texas, it has been celebrated since 1866, but across these communities, the celebration started around the 1870s. And so I also wanted to offer you, beyond the Juneteenth celebration and the historical background of Juneteenth, more insight into these meanings of freedom that connect this history of Juneteenth, and how Juneteenth is truly a history that connects all of us. So I want to bring your attention to this map, and this is the map that I drew. I'm not an expert, I'm not a geographer, but I hope it gives you a visual on what these mobilities look like at that point. And if you see here, some of these arrows don't represent one person or two, it's just journeys that I have been able to trace of groups and generalizing of people, where they were coming from and where they were going, in a way that I was trying to offer myself as I was finishing my dissertation, a visual that connected not only Underground Railroad histories or Underground Railroad pathways north, but also really connecting other Underground Railroad channels that were leading to Mexican spaces, that were leading as far as Mexican Arizona or California, even actually north and to other Canadian spaces as Vancouver. And so this is a better representation, or not a better representation, but one that would also offer you a little bit more context. If you start thinking about this vast borderlands that exists between the US and Mexico, you start seeing that these spaces have changed due to power exchanges or the political changes. Even the border has changed naturally and politically. So you start seeing when people are crossing these spaces, the spaces are fluid. Spaces like Texas, for instance, were part of Mexico up until 1836. Spaces like Southern Arizona were part of Mexico up until 1853. And really, the Mexican government did not leave after the Gadsden Purchase. They actually stayed up until they left 1856. That's when all Mexican government left places like Arizona, like Tucson, Arizona. And of course, we all know, like, the vast territory acquired after the Mexican-American War were also spaces that were Mexican. And so people were making it all across all these vast spaces. So I wanted to show you this before I continue to offer you a little bit more context about what freedom, or the meaning of freedom, or the levels of freedom that people encountered in Mexican spaces. So as you see here, I have given you sort of like a visual of Mexican legal abolition. One of the things that I do in my work is situate Mexico as a space of freedom, but also as a place of struggle. When, for instance, Mexico had been passed, or Mexican spaces had passed several different laws, even before they were an independent nation. So Mexico, under the Spanish rule, had implemented some laws, some decrees that started or sparked the process of abolition in Mexican spaces. So all of these laws shaped the meaning of freedom that people encountered when they reached Mexican spaces. And I will not read all these laws, but it's just to offer you context of how abolition was shaped on Mexican spaces and what Black people encountered that had left the US to be free once they reached those spaces. So a large portion of the work that I do is to explain that even though Mexican legal abolition existed and was there on paper, freedom, or the meaning of freedom, was actually not just shaped by those laws. It was shaped by the mobility, by the presence and the liberation practices of thousands of Black Americans who made those journeys to claim freedom for themselves and to secure it. And so I wanted to share with you a few of the stories of the women that I have found. And women as Sylvia Hector, a woman who I consider in the same context as Harriet Tubman. And so, for instance, when I started this work back when I was an undergraduate, I was born and raised in Mexico. I didn't really know a lot about the history of Mexico, to be honest. I didn't really know or understand the history of Black roots or the Black presence in Mexico. But I did know that Mexico abolished slavery in 1829. So I kind of knew a little bit about this decree right here, right? And so I was taking one of the required courses as an undergraduate, of the history of the Old South or the American South. And we were talking about Harriet Tubman. And so I wanted to, and her journeys to help people to Canada. And I raised my hand and I asked my professor, Dr. Denard, he was one of the best professors I've ever had. Can you tell me how many people went to Mexico? And also, can you tell me who was the Harriet Tubman that led people to Mexico? And he actually said, that's a very good question, Maria. If you find out, please let me know. And so that is what got me started in looking for these histories, in looking for the Harriet Tubmans, in looking for the people that fought for their own freedom. And I did find people like Sylvia Hector, for instance, who was a woman that secured her liberation. Or, she fought for her freedom within Texas. She arrived in Texas enslaved in 1826. And by 1834, she had secured her freedom in Mexican Texas with the help of the man that she later married. She secured her freedom. I was able to find her freedom papers and actually share the freedom papers with some of her descendants who had never seen those papers before. But she, once free, she made it her business to assist other people seeking freedom. And so she started ferrying people to freedom from, she was living at first in 1834 when she secured her freedom in Central Texas, so in the area of Austin, Texas. And she was ferrying people all the way down to the Matagorda Bay area in her ferry. Of course, in that space after 1836, when the Texas Revolution happened, it became very hard for free Black people to live in Texas. In fact, there were laws that prohibited Black persons from living in Texas, as well as Mexicans from living in Texas. So she actually ended up moving to South Texas, around Hidalgo County, right on the border, right on the Rio Bravo area. And there she continued ferrying people to freedom. And until 1861, when the Civil War broke up, her family and her children were labeled Unionists. And she ended up taking some of her children and moving all the way to Tamaulipas, where she stayed herself. She took herself to freedom, and she remained there up until about 1870. And after that, she actually returned to her ranch in Texas, in South Texas. But I situate her in the stories as someone who fought for freedom, not only for her own freedom, but helped others secure that their own liberation. And so I situate her as a freedom fighter, a foundational actor that we all must learn about when we talk about slavery and freedom in those shared histories that connect the US and Mexico. And so, but Sylvia is not the only person that I have been able to trace in these histories of, fighting for liberation. There were many, many people that I have found, including Matilda and David Thomas, for instance. And I will give you briefly the story of Matilda. Matilda was born enslaved in Louisiana, but by 1850, she decided to run away, or she had already run away by 1850. She had made it to Mexico, and she was able to secure not only her freedom, but she found a job. She was living, and she had her own home, and she was working for a rancher called Don Manuel Luis del Fierro. And on one night, of course, she had escaped her enslaver. And at that point, slaveholders across the US were complaining, based on all the petitions that I found in Mexico from slaveholders saying, we're losing a lot of money. You need to allow us to go retrieve them, or we need to sign an extradition treaty for us to bring them back, or you need to let us go in and retrieve them. Of course, Mexico never signed an extradition treaty, but slaveholders like Matilda would hire slave hunters to go into Mexico and find out where their former enslaved people were. And the slave hunters found Matilda. They went back to the enslaver, told him where she was, and then he planned to go in and kidnap her and bring her back to the US. And so he did. On August of 1850, he broke into her house and tried to take her and her daughter Harriet. And she began fighting with all that she had. She started hitting him. She started yelling and screaming for help. One of the slave hunters took Harriet and rode away with her. And but the neighbors woke up. The neighbors came to her help. Don Manuel Luis del Fierro came to help her as well. and they were able to stop the slave hunter from the former enslaver from taking her back to the US. On the contrary, they were able to take him to the local jail where they committed him to jail, and she gave her testimony. And so this is one of the reasons we know what happened. And actually her daughter was actually saved from being returned by the slave hunter. There was some neighbors in the next town that were able to stop the slave hunter and take Harriet back from him, bringing her back to her mother. And there's many, many stories like this that are found in records all across Mexico, but also in the US. For instance, we have David Thomas, who was a man who left the US slavery, made it to Mexico. And he says, para salvar a su familia de la esclavitud. And he took his daughter and his 3 grandchildren with him. So it offers you this idea that people were not just running alone. Men were not the only ones who were running. You know, you see women running and taking their children and fighting to be free, but also men taking their daughter and 3 children to save them from a lifetime of enslavement. And so these are some of the histories. You know, time is of the essence right now, but these are some of the histories that I focus that has allowed me to situate, or to reconsider what freedom meant, or at least what the levels of freedom were like that people found across this vast borderlands, but also in Mexican spaces. And generally, I think the stories that I've shared with you today allows us to better understand that also the histories of Juneteenth and celebrations and why we celebrate it, but also why Juneteenth is celebrated in Mexican spaces as well. So I hope that this has offered you some new knowledge that you can share and take. And I think that one of the reasons that I do the work that I do is not only because these are foundational stories, foundational actors that shaped our shared histories, but I think that these histories can also allow us in our communities to challenge not only the erasure of Black roots and the Black presence and Black actors, but really to challenge anti-Blackness in our communities, because just, anti-Blackness is not something facing the United States, it's also something facing Mexican spaces as well. So with that, I leave you, and I'm here for questions, and I hope that we can have an amazing conversation with, with all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hammack. So nice to have you with us. And before we get started with the Q&A, I would like to thank Dr. Cynthia Gooch-Grayson, who is Metro's Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, who initially made the invitation to Dr. Hammack to come. This is a perspective on Juneteenth that we may not have thought of without her help in finding you.
Thank
so
you
we
so
have
much.
a question that's coming from an audience member.
Okay.
Please provide more detail of the 4,000 acres given to the Black Seminoles in contrast to the US's unfulfilled promise of 40 acres and a mule.
So in the context, what I could say about that is that in the US, the 40 acres and a mule, that never actually happened. If you read some of the histories, that was a promise that was largely unfulfilled or remained largely unfulfilled. In Mexico, they actually did receive those land grants. And today, many of these individuals and families live on those lands that are and have been there since the 1850s. And so the other aspect of that is in Mexico, citizenship was on the table. So they could get citizenship in very many ways. It wasn't an easy process either, I should say, but citizenship was on the table. And so once you could claim citizenship and became one, you had rights like any other citizen. And as I like to say, in Mexico, I guess we were just being born and raised in Mexico. I could say people were equally unequal in these processes, because poverty is something that has faced, that a lot of communities have faced, including Black communities, Native communities, and a lot of mestizo communities, Mexican, Black Mexican mixed ancestry. So that's what I would answer that question with that.
Thank you. And regarding the 4,000 acres, I apologize if you stated this. Would we still find descendants on those properties today?
Yes, yes. Yeah, so the myth, there is a myth that has been very prevalent in Mexico, that there are no Black people in Mexico, that there's no Black Mexicans. And that is certainly a myth. People of African ancestry live all across Mexico. Individuals and communities are, there's Black communities in Mexico that you can actually see, and they have been there, not only from this. So the work that I do focuses on the second diaspora, right? Focuses on individuals who were enslaved in the US and made it to Mexico in the late 1800s, or the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. But Black Mexicans have been in Mexico since the colonial era. A lot of people don't know or don't learn that Mexico is one of the largest importers of people from African nations during the colonial era, when it was under the Spanish crown. And actually was, I should say, second, because Brazil was certainly the largest, but it was certainly larger than the US and the people that actually reached the US. And so from the very moment that they arrived in Mexican spaces, people were fighting for their freedom and finding ways to become free. And so free Black Mexicans were real, were existing, were living and thriving since the 1500s, since this period of time when they arrived enslaved, because enslaved people always were fighting to be free and finding ways to do so in any of the spaces that they reached in the Americas. And Mexico was certainly not an exception. They were doing that, they were claiming freedom. We hear stories of Yanga, for instance, who was brought enslaved to places like Veracruz in the area of Orizaba. And he led a revolt and went up to the mountains where he secured his freedom and lived free for many years. And actually, they established this free Black community in Mexico in the 1500s. And they ended up giving assistance to the Mexican government in exchange for, like, okay, you're going to promise to not even ever try to re-enslave us, and we'll help you fight your enemy. So you start seeing that free Black people existed in Mexico and have lived and thrived in Mexico since the colonial era. So it's no surprise that when people were coming, trying to be free from the US in the late 18th and 19th centuries, they were finding ways to find those spaces where they could live free and be free. Some of them were going to those communities that had been free Black communities since the colonial era, but a lot of them that I have found have actually just gone and settled in cities. They've gone to Guadalajara, they've gone to Mexico City, they've gone to Coahuila. The colonies in Coahuila, because they're Black Seminole colonies and they arrived in the 1850s, as I mentioned, they remained very close-knit, but they were still, accepting and inviting people to come if they were needing refuge and they were escaping from slavery. And so, yeah, you do find these communities not only across North Mexico, but, or Veracruz. A lot of people tend to think, there's free Black communities in Veracruz and Acapulco, because that's where the large majority of enslaved people were brought during the colonial era. But there is Black Mexicans all across the country. As a matter of fact, I grew up in Sinaloa, Mexico, in Los Mochis, but the first Black settlers of California came from the Mazatlan era, so came from Sinaloa. And so, yeah, I think that the histories that I'm trying to bring forth hopefully will enable a new visibilizing of Black Mexicans, which have been there. They haven't been erased, they're not gone, they're very much part of Mexico.
So Dr. Hammack, you did mention that when you started to explored, there was a lot that you still needed to learn before you could address the topics of your research interests, right? But in general, would you say that Mexican education teaches about the Black population and its history in the country, or is that something people have to find on their own?
So the Mexican education system is certainly lacking in highlighting Black roots. It wasn't until perhaps like in the last 10, 15 years that education in Mexico has started to shift to be more inclusive. And I'm not talking about just of Black Mexicans, but even of Native Mexicans. And so I think that one of the things that is going on in Mexico in that context to make sure that they are including in our history textbooks, that they are taught about in K through 12, is this movement for visibilization. And so if many of you may recall or not, in the 1990s, 1994 precisely, Native communities, there were uprisings of Native communities because they wanted access to education. They wanted to be part of the larger Mexican government. And they were saying, hey, we don't have access to resources, education, health, and we don't feel like we're part of Mexico. We're going to break out. And this was happening in 1994. But what this prompted was Native communities began to travel and talk about and ensure that their erasure was gone away, that they were visible, that they were there, they were also part of the country. And that was their doing. They were very active in that to today. So now you don't see a Mexico without Native communities, right? And so in the last 10, 15 years, Black communities in Mexico have begun to do that. And you start seeing Black Mexicans taking that active role in fighting against erasure of their own histories, in fighting of their invisibilization, because they have been experiencing that, invisibility, even though they've been there. Even people from abroad, they say, oh, there's no Black people in Mexico. And they're like, hey, we've been here, we're not talked about. Our history books don't talk about it. And so, yeah, I think that the Mexican education system is very much lacking in highlighting what constitutes Mexico. We're not just a country of mixed heritage people. We have Black communities, we have Native communities. And I think that is an aspect that Mexico has a lot of work to do, and apparently a long way to go as well. So
thank you. And as a follow-up to that, an audience member has asked, your last slide showed Black Mexican presidents. Are they discussed in classrooms?
So in the last 10, 15 years, that's when people have started discussing, for instance, Guerrero, Vicente Guerrero, the person that that issued the decree abolishing slavery in 1829. Up until about 15 years ago, people didn't really talk about that he was actually a Black Mexican. His grandparents were enslaved. And so, people don't hear that because it is not taught. But recently it started to be taught that, yes, he was Black Mexican, as well as, for instance, Morelos, Jose Maria Morelos, who also was one of the leaders of independence. He was also Black Mexican. Juan Alvarez, who also was a Mexican president in 1855. Very short period he was president, but he was also Black Mexican. And I think that in general, this is part of the histories that, Mexican people don't learn as well, but they're actually starting to come up, and people are starting to say, hey, why aren't we learning this? And I think that part of the work that I do is prompting this knowledge, this questioning or inquiry that hopefully will push history textbooks in Mexico, not just in the US, to change and to highlight the diverse histories that we have.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much. I think for a lot of us, as we entered your presentation and as we watch it, there's the intent to compare how is the US different from Mexico on this topic, right? And it definitely is a similarity that here many of us have been saying let's get the full history, right? Let's maybe change some textbooks or update some textbooks. And interestingly, we say that the state of Texas controls textbooks across the whole United States.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts on that. I haven't lived in Texas for over 6 years. It was truly interesting living in that space where they do have a lot of power, like the legislature, and then the authorities have a lot of power in what is produced and what is printed, what is taught. As a matter of fact, I was, because my advisor was very active in fighting these erasures, I was part of a group alongside her that was testifying in the Texas Board of Education to just push for Texas to teach children, K through 12 children, to be allowed that slavery was a major aspect of the Civil War, because up until 2018, Texas children or textbooks in K through 12 and teachers were not allowed to teach that slavery was a major part. They only taught that the Civil War, the major aspect that led to the Civil War was the problem with states' rights, but states' rights to have slavery. And so up until 2018, K through 12 students in Texas were not learning that slavery was a major factor in the Civil War. But now, based on that work that professors did, like my advisor, they decided to change. There actually was a victory for professors to say, okay, from now on, Texas is going to change those standards of teaching to include curricula that includes, the real reasons why the Civil War were fought. And I think similarly, I've had a lot of thoughts about this, considering Mexico and what we are now taught in Mexico. And I think Mexico is also making strides to change things. But again, it is a process, but I think that, or I hope that the work that I presented today offers you that this history in a way that you're able to see, the problems with erasure and the histories that are not taught is not only a problem of the US or Texas. It's a problem, it's a collective issue across the borders on both sides. Mexico has the same problem. And similarly, Mexico has the same problems with racism and anti-Blackness, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that if we understand that anti-Blackness and racism is not just a problem, a US problem, that it is a US and Mexico problem, and largely it's an America's problem because it is across the continent, I think we will have a better understanding of how to challenge that, but also, how to help bring change, how to fight that. So
yeah,
I hope that helps.
That's very helpful. And again, everybody in the audience, I usually don't share your names because I want you to feel really comfortable to ask questions. So the comment has come in. Please remember that Texas is one of the greatest influences on all textbook publishers. So if that information is not in a Texas textbook, it's probably not in the one that you're using in your classrooms either. Would only be added in if your instructors choose to do so. And another little point I wanted to ask you is, do you know if K through 12 in Texas students are taught that it took 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation for some of the slaves to find out that they could even be free? Do you think they're teaching that?
The majority, they're not, but there are some amazing teachers out there that have been doing this work and they have been teaching their students. I think that it has fallen on the Black community to teach that, to teach their own, the real version, that aspect of that history. And they've been very active in fighting that erasure and fighting for a more inclusive history. And so you see, Black teachers, Black communities doing independent scholarship producing curriculum without pay. So they've done a lot of labor that should be done collectively. And I think that it's not only the job or the responsibility of Black communities and Black teachers to be doing this work. I think that as a Mexican, I think that Mexican American teachers and communities are also part of this history, so they have the responsibility to be doing this work as well. And I hope that I'm part of the solution and I'm not part of the problem, right? So I think that that's one of the things that I try to bring forth with the work that I do, to say, hey, it's our collective work. We need to be working together to change how we're teaching and to bring those untold or undertold stories to the children and to the future generations, because that's the only way that we're going to have a more inclusive, US history, but also, the history of North America. When we talk about slavery and freedom, what does that mean? And it's usually very US centric, but I think we need to broaden it up, broaden that timeline, those actors, those geographies that shaped, North America. And so I think that is a good start. At least that's what I tell myself.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're getting close to the end, but there's a couple of other points that I wanted to ask you to give us your thoughts on. You mentioned the Black Seminoles. You mentioned Black Cree.
Mm-hmm.
Was it more likely that the Black slaves with Native ancestry also were going into Mexico?
Yes,
And
yes.
why
So,
would they be, what do you have a sense of why that would have been?
yes, so when they were being removed from places like Florida, a lot of these communities were already mixed. So they were Native Seminoles, but there were also people that already called themselves Black Seminoles or Muskogee, because of the history that had been there. Also, at that early time in the colonial era, in the 1560s, I believe, and I can't think of the exact date, but the Spanish crown issued a decree that any enslaved person from the Carolinas could become free in places like Florida, which was a Spanish colony, part of the Spanish crown. And so people were already coming, enslaved people were coming from the Carolinas and becoming free, living with Seminole people. And that's how they intermarried. That's how they became Black Seminoles. So by the time they were being removed to places like Oklahoma, they were being removed together, because, you couldn't differentiate Seminoles and Black Seminoles at that point. But that also is inclusive. These movements were inclusive of two things that sometimes we forget. A lot of people were, also running away. They were still running away from other plantations in the Carolinas, or in this displacement, this Seminole Wars that happened in this eastern seaboard, like the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. There was a lot of chaos. So people were running away and seeking refuge with these Black Seminoles and Seminole groups. And they were going with them to Oklahoma, but also they were going with them to Mexico. And so there were a lot of people that were perhaps not Black Seminole, but they had run away from slavery and they wanted to be free. They were also going with these groups. Now, that is important. The other aspect that is very important to mention is that several Native communities and several Native tribes were also slaveholders and ascribed to the institution of chattel slavery. They themselves owned slaves, and they sometimes sold them, and they participated in that institution. I found individuals who reached Mexico, as early as the 1830s, actually 1820s, late 1820s. They had run away from, Comanche individuals, Comanche communities, and they would say, hey, so for instance, one of the cases that I found is this man named Peter, who arrived in Mexico, and he said, and he was actually kidnapped and brought back to San Antonio. Then he made it back and he gave his testimony. He said, hey, I made it here a couple of years ago. I was kidnapped and now I made it back again. I want to be able to get my, secure my freedom. So he was telling the Mexican authorities, so you need to help me, protect me, but also I want you to help me bring my wife, who's still enslaved by Native enslavers. So you start seeing these histories come to life when you find sort of records that tell you who was participating in this, in slavery. And we must not forget that Native communities were also slaveholders in some spaces.
All right. Wonderful. You've given us so much marvelous information. I really appreciate that. I have some other questions in my mind, but I'll have to just get those at another time. Thank you, audience, for being attentive. Thank you for prioritizing your time to either enhance your education at Metropolitan Community College or be a lifelong learner. Dr. Hammack, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
I just, first and foremost, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who made it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. It has been a pleasure, and just keep an eye out for my book. And, you know, hopefully you can share it with your students. You can share these histories, whatever you learned today, take it to your families, take it to your to young people, share these histories, because I think that that's how we bring awareness, by sharing what we learn.
Thank you so much. It's just a great pleasure to have met you, albeit virtually. Everybody remember, you always have a front row seat when we're speaking virtually. So that's one of your benefits, right?
Sure.
Dr. Hammack, thank you again.
Thank you so much.